Hello and welcome back. And this isn't the video I was planning to make today, but I've had such a stinker of a comment from one of my American viewers that it actually warranted a response, because it's not the first comment I've had from Americans regarding this topic, and that is personal safety and security and sort of rules around firearms and self-defense in the UK while you're out kind of wild camping and doing your outdoor thing. So in the spirit of international cooperation, I just want to put this together. Now, when I got this comment from DG9, my first assumption was that it was from some teenage American boy who played too many video games. And after checking his channel, it turns out I was wrong, because while he's only got 110 subscribers, he's actually been on YouTube for about 9 years now, and he's made something like 338 videos. And that was a real surprise to me for two reasons. The first one was, how little progress he's made in 9 years, but the biggest surprise was that means he must be in his early 20s at least, and that's old enough to know better. So I thought I'd put this video together for DG9 and for other people of similar ilk, so that they can understand why our gun laws in the UK work for us, and that might differ from what your experience is in America. And for the record, before we start, I just want to say that I quite like our American cousins, and I am not about to tell an American whether they should have gun control or anything like that in their own country, because it's their country and they know what is best for them. What I am going to do is explain why our rules on gun control and self-defense work for us. Now, in doing that, I'm going to draw some comparisons between our two great nations, and I'm going to do that in the context of trying to explain the differences and why our rules work for us. Please don't think I'm disrespecting America if those comparisons are not favourable, because I'm not trying to measure which is the better country here. I'm just trying to give context to my arguments. Brushing off that comment that's been made about my country, the second misconception that DG9 has is that we're not allowed to defend ourselves in our own country, because we are, and that includes the use of deadly force. The key difference between self-defense in the UK and self-defense in America is that any defense you make of yourself, it has to be reasonable and proportional. So for example, if I'm out wild camping in the UK, somebody comes into my camp at night and attacks me with their bare hands, then I'm perfectly justified in fighting that person until they are no longer a threat to myself. That would be perfectly justified. However, if I then got that person on the floor and then beat them to a pulp to teach them a lesson, then that wouldn't be a reasonable use of force. It would be going, above and beyond, and that could land me in trouble. Likewise, my response has got to be proportional. So if that same man came into my camp at night, attacked me with his bare hands, and I picked up the camp axe and I hit him with the axe and killed him, that wouldn't be proportional, and that would also get me into trouble. So self-defense is definitely possible in the UK. You just have to not escalate and use the minimum amount of force necessary to ensure your safety. Now, the outcome of British law in terms of self-defense is that it discourages escalation, and this is a really key thing now. We are actively discouraged from escalating a fight and taking it to the next level, and that works for us. And I'll explain why that works for us later on. Now, in America, you have, in many states, this thing called stand your ground rules. And what this means is you can use deadly force with a firearm as the first means of defending yourself when you feel threatened. And the outcome of those rules is that that sort of escalation isn't discouraged in the same way as it is under UK law. And when you look at those stand your ground rules and shooting first in the context of firearm ownership in the US, it kind of makes sense. And that's because if the other person has a gun and there's guns around, then you've got very few options of dealing with the other person should they pull out a gun, and you've also got very little time. So under those circumstances, in many ways, it actually makes sense to preempt, act first to ensure your safety, and take the first steps to ensure you're the one that goes home. I get that. That is different in America. In the UK, we don't really have a lot of guns. Private ownership of guns, you can't carry them in public anywhere outside of the police and armed forces. They're just not allowed in public. and private ownership is very, very rare, you know, in the UK population. Outside of the police and the military, I've never even seen a firearm. And the difference there is that we're very, very unlikely to come into contact with anybody with a firearm when we're out and about in the woods. And what that does is that buys us time, because we know that no one's going to pull a gun out and end that confrontation very quickly. We've got time to de-escalate, we've got time to sort it out without resorting to violence, and that gives us more options in terms of levels of response, because we don't have to respond with deadly force, we can just respond with fists and less deadly means of defending ourselves. So that is a really key difference. The typical NRA response to gun control is that if you outlaw guns, then only the outlaws will have them. And I don't actually disagree with that, because it does make perfect logical sense. But what the UK have done is they've also controlled the supply of firearms. And that's the key difference here, because there just aren't the guns in circulation for the outlaws to get hold of. There are a couple, within kind of really sort of high end sort of organised crime groups, but your average run-of-the-mill criminal just can't get hold of them because they're that rare. And so that argument that only the outlaws will have guns doesn't really stack up in the context of UK gun ownership and UK gun control. Another comment that Americans have quite often left in the comment section on some of my videos is that without guns, we're much more likely to be a victim of crime. And that may well be the case in America, and I can understand why it would be, because if you have a prevalence of guns in your society and one small group doesn't have them, then naturally they would be a little bit more vulnerable by comparison. But in the UK, where we don't have that prevalence of guns, and in fact they're very, very rare, then we found it's exactly the opposite, because nobody has guns, and therefore one group isn't more sort of vulnerable than the other. And we found as a whole within our society that without guns, we are 8 times less likely to be a victim of homicide in the unarmed UK as you are in America, which is armed for self-defense. So there's something clearly going wrong there with that kind of logic and thought when you apply it outside of the context of America and try to apply that to a country like the UK where we don't have that prevalence of firearms. And another misconception that DG9 has is that without a firearm, you've simply got no way of defending yourself at all. It's written like a foregone conclusion that you're going to lose. And I can understand that in the context of America, because where you do have a large prevalence of firearms there, if you're fighting somebody with a firearm and you don't have one, then you've got almost no chance of winning that whatsoever. But here's the key thing. I'm not in America, I'm from the UK, and we just don't have that prevalence of firearms here. And the idea that you can't defend yourself against somebody when you both are armed, then that's obviously a complete fallacy, because men have been in confrontation for thousands of years before firearms even existed. Now, I can kind of get DG9's point of maybe he's a gamer, a young gamer, and maybe he hasn't spent the time playing physical contact sports and develop that kind of physical development that a lot of us have who enjoy the outdoors. So maybe he would feel like he wouldn't have a chance of winning that physical confrontation. But for a lot of us who spend time outdoors, we're used to physical exercise, and we've got at least a 50-50 chance of defending ourselves, and more if we employ some of the tactics and skills that I actually talked about in that video that was commented on. Now, gun ownership in America is a really touchy subject, and I'm not about to tell an American that they shouldn't have a gun in their own country, because they know their own country better than I do, and it is completely up to them. I don't have a say in that whatsoever. What I will say is that in the UK, we don't need firearms at all outside of agriculture, for a bit of kind of vermin control. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. The first one is that, getting back to that kind of outdoor theme, is we just don't have the large predators that you do. So there are no bears, there's no wolves or coyotes. The biggest thing we're likely to come into contact with is an angry badger, or if you know your Monty Python, the killer rabbit of Caer Banog. It's just, predators just aren't a thing that we need to think about. And that's one of the reasons why we simply don't need them here. another comment that Americans quite often leave is that without firearms, it's inevitable that a population will be oppressed by its government. And that might be true in America. You guys know your country and your government better than I do. But what I can say is I think the UK's been around since about 1707 when we joined up with Scotland, and we haven't been oppressed yet. Everything seems to be going pretty well, to be honest. Now, if you look at the, I think it's called the Democracy Matrix by The Economist, it actually shows that the UK actually scores higher on democracy, including on liberty, than America does. And I'm sorry if if that triggered anybody. It's not intentional. It's just pointing out some facts that maybe you need to be aware of. Now, it's not just an isolated incident, because there are actually 27 other countries that score higher for democracy than the USA does. Um, and I'm not saying that to say America's bad, because it isn't, and there isn't a lot in the scoring. The reason I bring that up is to say, or is to prove the point, that you don't need firearms to have democracy and liberty, because lots of other countries have managed to do it without having kind of firearms for self-defense. Now, yes, I know there are some countries that don't have liberty and don't have democracy who aren't armed, but the fact that so many have managed it without being armed shows that there's something else in play here, and it's not just a case of whether you've got firearms or not. The other cultural difference I've noticed, although that gap is starting to close a little bit, is Americans seem to be more polarised in their views than they are in the UK. And they seem to be less willing to kind of find common ground. And from what my experiences of kind of talking to people on the internet and my trips to America as well, is that people are more interested in winning an argument rather than trying to work out whether they're actually in the right in the first place. And when two people both have that approach where they both want to win the argument, then obviously, that is more likely to kind of escalate, because no one wants to kind of give any ground. And I've heard this saying on Americans a few times now, where you've got to escalate to de-escalate. And of course, where you've got two people who both want to escalate to de-escalate, well, there can only be one outcome from that, can't there? Now, in the UK, the phrase I hear more often is, let's agree to disagree. I think in general, we're a little bit more conciliatory. We try and find common ground and try and work together, even though we don't always agree with what each other's saying. And I think, again, that's another reason why it doesn't escalate to the use of kind of deadly force as quickly or as often as it does in America, because it is obviously a lot higher in terms of your homicide rates than it is compared to ours. So, in summary, I am not passing judgment or making comments on American gun laws or American laws on self-defense within the context of America. What I am doing is responding to American views on UK gun law and self-defense within the context of the UK. And I've just drawn a couple of comparisons there to explain why our rules work for us. Now, I think I've shown that not having guns in the UK doesn't make us more likely to be a victim, because our homicide rates are actually 8 times lower than they are in the States. And I think I've also shown that without firearms, we haven't been oppressed by a government. We have a democratic society with lots of liberty. Now, with regards to kind of GG9 and his comments, there's no ill feelings there. Although I don't think he intended his comments to be helpful, and they were a bit more combative in nature, he's actually given me a really good idea for a video. So thanks very much, DG9. And if you are into gaming, go check out his channel, give him a bit of a boost, because this is all about cooperation and good feelings rather than kind of negative ones. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And with any luck, I'll see you next time.